Hi, my name is Megan Deppa, and this is my final project for Psychology of Sustainability. And I decided to do my topic on psychology and climate change communication. So, a little background of climate change. The effects of human caused climate change have been steadily rising globally for decades, but have just gotten to the point where they are being felt and changing the daily lives of many. As global temperatures continue to rise, several threats loom over the planet, including but not limited to sea level rise, extreme storms, endangered species, and health risks. Without climate mitigation policies in place, the climate crisis will continue to uncontrollably worsen. There is an overwhelming amount of evidence that climate mitigation efforts are needed. If temperatures were to continue rising at the rate they are now, we would be seeing a 3.2 to 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit increase by 2100 if emissions are not controlled. This rate and extreme magnitude of change is unprecedented in human history and can only be compared to rates previously experienced tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago, associated with natural geological climate cycles. Climate change in the media has been a topic of conversation for years, pulling at people's heartstrings with sad looking polar bears and horrific natural disasters, but we rarely get to hear them speak about factual points or reasons to have hope about the current state of our climate. But these stories, also in the media, are often misconstrued or inaccurate, and this can be exhausting as a consumer, as it gives off the assumption that we should feel helpless and that there is nothing we can do to help. Before climate change mitigation can even begin to become more successful, it needs to be communicated effectively in order for people to be fully aware of the gravity of this problem. By using psychological concepts in communicating about climate change, we would see a greater success in the reduction of climate related disasters. So, in order to communicate climate change more effectively, specific psychological factors need to be addressed, including how information is presented to the public, emotional appeals, and encouraging behavioral change. So, how information is presented to the public. Before any discussion about climate change can take place, there must be an understanding that there is variability in human impacts. Some groups are more geographically vulnerable, like those living in low coastal areas, or some may be more economically vulnerable based on different infrastructure impacts. These different types of vulnerabilities interact and should be taken into consideration before making any attempts for climate change communication. For climate action to be successful, first the information needs to be presented in a way that overcomes these barriers, such as the vulnerabilities I just spoke about. Once clear, concise communication is effectively presented, climate change mitigation can start to take place. And then moving on to emotional appeals, climate change is an emotionally triggering topic for most, as many headlines use harsh and anxiety inducing language to entice readers in. While an emotional appeal to readers may pull them in at first, using this tactic can soon backfire as emotional fatigue from the subject can set in. Even the most worried of people have a limited capacity for worry that they can handle and how many worries they can have at once. One major factor when it comes to climate change is the emotional numbing effect it can have on people. Emotional numbing happens after repeat exposure and emotionally draining situations. This can happen in a lot of different circumstances, but we usually see it in like war zones or like over prolonged like hurricane threat coverage, but there's danger in overexposure of information, especially in this age's media coverage with the 24-hour news cycle. There are several ways to avoid numbing. an audience to climate change communication. The brain can only take so much emotional information at once. So, by balancing emotional triggers with analytical information, it'll help people retain the information better, but it will also not emotionally trigger them. Um, Being in communication with those receiving the information can help as well, about how numb they're feeling about a certain topic, especially like climate change. Um, and it can also be helpful to see how to proceed with how the information should be given. Excuse me. People have so many more immediate pressing issues in everyday life, so balancing pre existing concerns and climate change related issues will help to move forward with mitigation techniques. Inducing fear and pain in the media can lead to emotional limitations when it comes to take action. Too much fear can lead to feeling helplessness and thus getting stuck in inaction. People will get caught up in managing their emotional response rather than taking the action needed. Some element of fear is usually used to attract attention to the story, but in order to overcome emotional limitations, we must balance fear with hope. People need to be told that there is a reason for the need for action, but also that their actions will bring a positive outcome in mitigation efforts. And then lastly, encouraging behavioral change. In the end, behavioral change is needed in order to create lasting change in climate change mitigation. Oftentimes, climate change communicators will explain how to change everyday behaviors to be more pro environment, but it is needed to take it a step further and place our policymakers, business leaders, and environmental organizations accountable for making the environmentally responsible option the default option. Over time, having the default option be a better behavior, this will affect their overall preferences over time and make consumption decisions shift. By making socially beneficial choices the default option, policymakers can positively influence individual decisions concerning natural resources like air and water. Um, Another way that you can incentivize people is to have people be rewarded for a good changed behavior. So when people are rewarded immediately for a good or changed behavior, long-term behavioral change is extremely likely. The use of incentives make behavioral changes easier and more impactful. For example, sharing with people that over the next 20 years you will see a return on your investment in wind energy may not make someone excited because they have to wait and be patient for so long before their reward is returned. When using an incentive like a tax break or rebates of certain items immediately, the behaviors are more likely to change and align with these incentives. So, how do these implementations impact climate change mitigation? The way we communicate and the way in which we receive information has an extreme impact on our perception of certain issues. When it comes to the topic of climate change, in order for the three main concepts I just spoke about to be implemented, we must start with the communication presented in the media, which is in itself a huge undertaking. Having a specific widespread news source pertaining to factual climate based information is needed to prevent the spread of misinformation and fear based news, which will also prevent people from becoming numb to the topic of climate change. Ideally, once this is done and incentives are in place by policymakers and business owners, we will see a reduction in the emissions causing climate change and climate change related disasters. Then my conclusions. Climate change is the greatest threat to be presented to our planet and all life that inhabits it. The gravity of this problem is sometimes hard for those that do not receive accurate or reliable information to comprehend, but climate change mitigation is completely possible. Going back to the complete basics and better training those that relay mass information to people about an effective way to speak about climate change will make a major impact. Through the way information is presented, how emotional it is, and the behavioral changes, we can look forward to effectively mitigating climate change in the future. And then these are my sources that I used. And thanks for listening.